Right now on Real Talk with Denver7 and CPR News. The fight for control in Congress is starting far from the ballot box.
States are redrawing political maps years early, setting the stage for a power grab long before 2026.
States are rushing to embrace gerrymandering to solidify partisan power. Colorado's out of the game right now.
A redistricting showdown is underway, and the outcome could shift who holds power for a decade.
It doesn't make it fair to all the voters.
Today, we're breaking down how redistricting works and who gets left behind when the lines are drawn.
Welcome to Real Talk with Denver7 and CPR News. I'm Denver7's Micah Smith.
And I'm Colorado Public Radio's Nathan Fernando Frescas. Each week, in a partnership between Denver7 and CPR, we have a real talk about issues impacting underrepresented people across Colorado and amplifying voices you may not always hear.
Today, we're digging into a growing battle for political power across the country through redistricting. Who draws the political maps and who benefits is at the center of a new fight between Democrats and Republicans ahead of next year's congressional elections.
In August, Texas Republican Governor Greg Abbott signed a new congressional voting map into law designed to help the GOP gain 5 more seats in the 2026 midterms. It marked a win for President Donald Trump, who's been pressuring Republican-led states to redraw district lines and boost the party's chances of holding the House.
Democratic Governor Gavin Newsom in California quickly fired back, now asking voters to approve a map aimed at giving Democrats 5 more seats.
We're not just identifying a problem, we're actually trying to solve a problem. And it's a problem of their making. They shot the first bullet.
And now Missouri is also joining the fight. Republican Governor Mike Kehoe is calling lawmakers into a special session to redraw the state's U.S. House districts.
For context, states typically redraw congressional maps every 10 years after the census to adjust for population changes. They were last redrawn 5 years ago. This could reignite debates over redistricting rules across the country.
As for Colorado, voters already took a different path. In 2018, Coloradans passed amendments Y and Z, taking redistricting power away from state lawmakers and putting it in the hands of independent commissions.
So to help us break down what's really happening and how Colorado's redistricting system stacks up, we are joined now by Andy Kenny, editor of Denverite and former host of CPR's political podcast, Purplish.
Andy's done extensive reporting on Colorado's redistricting reform, so thank you so much for being here for this Real Talk.
Yes, this is making me remember a lot of stuff from 2020, 2018, and I'm happy to do it.
So give us a quick lay of the land here. Colorado lawmakers have said its independent commission is the way to redraw these congressional maps. Walk us through briefly how we got here and how the commission came to be.
It is an interesting story. One of the main reasons that we have these redistricting commissions is a guy named Kent Thiry. He's a multimillionaire, former CEO of DaVita, that's the healthcare company. And he's pushed lots of election law changes, election reforms. He, for example, is a big part of the reason that as an unaffiliated voter in Colorado, you can participate in each party's primaries. One of his biggest swings, his biggest ideas was these redistricting commissions. His stated goal was to get rid of gerrymandering, get the politicians out of the election map drawing process. And essentially he pressured or convinced state lawmakers from both parties to get behind this idea and to put these 2 constitutional amendments, state constitutional amendments, on the ballot in 2018. More than 70% of voters agreed with this idea that the power to redraw the maps should be in the hands of these independent commissions. That's how we got where we are today.
I think the key word there is independent. The makeup of the commission is 4 Republicans, 4 Democrats, and 4 unaffiliated voters, Andy. Now, these aren't lawmakers, are they? And that's by design. How did that go over with voters who approved it?
I think it's probably a big part of the reason that this was so popular. Again, 70% plus of people don't tend to agree on much at all. The way the whole selection of these commissioners works is pretty interesting. It's a long, convoluted process, but the upshot is that hundreds of fairly ordinary people from across the political spectrum applied to be on these commissions in this kind of 2020-ish redistricting cycle. And there were many steps and stages in choosing who got to be on the commission, because it's a really important job. And so there were all kinds of controls built in to help guarantee that this was a truly representative and almost a truly representative and broadly based commission. And the idea was that the commission was going to work with nonpartisan staff to try to draw these maps that obey the rules and the goals set forth in the amendments that were approved by voters.
Yeah. I know this was a hot topic here in Colorado in 2020, 2021, but let's get back to current events here with the push to redistrict certain states like California and Texas, of course, to give or take seats away from Congress to help or hurt the current administration. For states like Colorado, that's not really possible. Or would there be a way for lawmakers to change the way our districts are drawn?
Not in the short term. Voters put this in the state constitution. That's one of the hardest things to undo that can happen in Colorado law. Undoing it would require convincing voters again to take it out of the Constitution.
To go the other way, essentially.
That's right. You would need to get approval of more than 55% of state voters to re-amend the Constitution. And that actually legally, as far as I know, could not happen until the 2026 cycle. Even if you had the money, the support, it takes a lot of money actually and a lot of effort to put something on the ballot to begin with, much less to convince people to vote in favor of it. So all that, even if you had the support, could not happen until 2026 and would not go into effect until after these midterm elections.
Now, we talk about how there was overwhelming voter support for this, but what about the people that were against this commission? Can you give us a few reasons why they were like, this isn't where we want to go?
Yeah, you saw critiques come up during the campaign to create the commissions and during the work of the commissions itself. You know, some people thought that it didn't do enough to support third parties, that it was just going to lock in the major parties' powers. People criticized the commission during the process. You know, you saw one commissioner make these comments about kind of election conspiracies, which drew blowback. You saw debate about the maps themselves, that they were splitting up communities. They were not drawn in the way that people wanted. Anytime you do these, there's going to be a lot of debate.
Right.
But perhaps one of the biggest critiques we've heard, especially now, is from Democrats who feel like by going through with this, that Democrats gave up power, that they disarmed themselves. And now that we're in these gerrymandering wars, if you want to call it that, at the national level, where states are rushing to embrace gerrymandering to solidify partisan power, Colorado's out of the game right now. Colorado Democrats cannot do that. And yet that's also what voters wanted. And it's just an interesting dilemma because Colorado did the thing that in some ways many voters supported, that many voters might like to see nationwide, but which not all states have done. And so we're just not part of that dynamic right now and not able to, if you're a Democrat, do anything. If you're a Republican, you probably love that because it ensures that you don't get gerrymandered out of power.
And I think this is such a good example of how you feel when your party holds power. Because how did Democrats feel in 2003,
right.
2004,
right.
when Republicans were trying to do something similar? So it's really interesting how a decade, 2 decades can just change everything.
It comes down to this kind of profound argument where you could argue that doing this improves people's faith in the electoral process. When you know there's not this active effort to shift the elections in one direction or another. But you also can't control what other states do. So when other states don't obey that precept, you're just out of the game and you don't, there's nothing you can do about it for now.
Yeah. Andy Kenny, editor of Denver7, thank you so much for joining us for this Real Talk.
Thanks so much for having me.
Redistricting isn't just about maps, it's about who gets a voice and who gets silenced.
Yeah, coming up, we look at how communities can be left out, split up, or stripped of representation. Stay with us. This is Real Talk with Denver7 and CPR News. Welcome back to Real Talk with Denver7 and CPR News. I'm Colorado Public Radio's Nathan Fernando Frescas.
And I'm Denver7's Micah Smith. Today we're talking about redistricting, how it shapes power and representation in Colorado.
We've talked about the ongoing battle brewing nationwide over these maps. Now let's talk about who it affects the most. For communities of color, immigrant communities, and low-income residents, redistricting has too often been a tool of exclusion.
The census drives redistricting, but many people are undercounted due to language barriers, fears around immigration status, or a lack of trust in government. When that happens, communities are underrepresented for a decade.
And even when people are counted, districts can still be gerrymandered. That's when lines are drawn to split up or pack together those same communities, weakening their political power.
It is illegal under federal law, but it still happens. And it still means less representation for those who need it most. We wanted to hear from people directly impacted by redistricting. So here's our conversation with Barb Winery with the League of Women Voters, Greeley-Weld County.
Barb, in 2023, the League of Women Voters Greeley-Weld County, in partnership with the Latino Coalition of Weld County, filed a lawsuit against Weld County commissioners for not following redistricting requirements. What laws did you all feel they violated?
Well, to begin with, we had a couple laws at play. We had the home rule county rule around drawing boundaries for districts, which really just said they needed to divide 3 districts into equal populations. And they could draw the lines wherever they wanted as long as that was accomplished. And that is the number one criteria for redistricting. But that's where the process ended. The rest, there is a state law that was passed in House Bill 211047, which dealt with gerrymandering in county districts. And it provided a list of criteria by which the districts needed to be drawn in addition to just the population. One of them included keeping communities of interest together, also, and that's things that are common to the voters. And in particular, we were concerned about the minority population and whether or not that they were given majority preference as opposed to diluting the population and dividing it up. As it turned out, when we looked closely at the maps, the Latino population in particular had been divided into thirds. So there's only 30% in each of the 3 districts. They're also required to be competitive. They're also required to have contiguous lines. And they're also required to be compact. So there's a several lists of criteria they have to follow. Plus, there should be a process conducted by an independent redistricting commission.
On this already a little bit, mentioning how the Latino population was split up, but what other direct impacts would there have been to you and other voters if this was allowed to stand?
Well, certainly the majority party here in Weld County was, kept in favor. Redistricting is about whether or not do the politicians draw the lines or do the people the voters draw the lines. And when it comes to redistricting, more often than not, it's been the politicians involved in whichever party's in power chooses to draw lines that favor them in elections. So no matter what candidates are put up, you don't have much of a choice if you're in a minority party.
The Colorado Supreme Court did rule in your favor. What was your immediate reaction to that ruling?
It was a judgment in favor of the voters. Summary judgment in favor of the voters. First, I was very excited. I wasn't really sure, and I don't think Stacy, my co-plaintiff, was really sure where this was going to go and how far it was going to go. So we were very excited that we were able to persevere and win on really behalf of the democratic process for Weld County.
Where does the case stand today, Barb?
Well, it's over, and we have this last year, Weld County was asked to go through the redistricting process using that state law criteria, and we did it starting in March, and it ended on August 6th, but we followed the process. The county commissioners did appoint themselves the Independent Redistricting Commission, which is interesting, but they made it work. And we followed all the steps of appointing an advisory committee, which is a bipartisan committee made of the unaffiliated voters, the Republican voters, and the Democratic voters who drew 3 maps, which was required by the process. And they had held 3 public hearings. There was access to the process. There was information about the process. There was public involvement about the process. I couldn't have been more pleased at how it went.
I do want to get a little bit broader for a moment, though. How do you feel about what's happening in terms of redistricting throughout the country? And do you think that Colorado has a role to play?
Well, I'm upset. I'm actually, to be honest, angry that people are kind of trying to disrupt the process and corrupt the process because it doesn't make it fair to all the voters. As far as what Colorado can do, I've been looking into this. And we have a great system here because we do have an independent redistricting commission. And there was an NBC poll that a couple of weeks ago that came out and said that 82% of the United States population voters want an independent redistricting commission. Only 18% want their public or their elected officials drawing the maps. So I will say there's a bill in Congress right now at the House that's trying to intervene and prohibit redistricting between the two 10-year process. And we are really looking into the process of alternative voting methods, because if you go to alternative voting methods, that is one solution to deal with this.
All right, Barb Winery with the League of Women Voters, Greeley-Weld County. Thank you so much for joining us for this Real Talk.
Okay, thank you so much for having me.
Coming up, Colorado voters demanded fairness in redistricting and changed the state constitution to get it.
We're taking a closer look at how the independent process works and whether it's truly protecting the people it was built for. This is Real Talk with Denver7 and CPR News. Welcome back to Real Talk with Denver7 and CPR News. I'm Denver7's Micah Smith.
And I'm Colorado Public Radio's Nathan Fernando Frescas. All episode long, we've been talking about redistricting and the stakes it holds for representation, resources, and political power.
You just heard how political maps have been used to exclude communities across the country. Now let's dive deeper into the processes in place here in Colorado meant to protect against it.
As we mentioned earlier, voters decided to change Colorado's constitution in 2018, taking redistricting power out of the hands of lawmakers and giving it to an independent commission.
The goal was to make the process fairer, more transparent, and to protect communities from partisan influence. So now we want to know, how does that commission work, and has it lived up to its promise?
So joining us now is Jessica Shipley, Staff Director of the Colorado Independent Redistricting Commission. Jessica, thanks so much for being here today for this Real Talk.
Thank you for having me.
So what makes Colorado's redistricting process different from what we're seeing in states like Texas or California right now? Kind of give us that recap.
So as Andy mentioned earlier, we passed two constitutional amendments in 2018 here in Colorado by a fairly wide margin that created two new independent commissions, one to do state redistricting and one to do congressional redistricting. And we put in place in those constitutional amendments a lot of things to try to guarantee some transparency, some to take it out of the political realm and put it somewhere more with the citizens of the state.
Yeah.
And to do that, we set up it's a very convoluted process to choose each of the commissions, but once they're chosen, there are a lot of things in place that require public meetings before anything can be discussed, and lots of notice requirements, things to make sure that nothing's getting done in a back room. And I would have to say that I think it was pretty successful. We took the original maps around to 39 different public meetings around the state and heard input from as many people as wanted to sign up, ready to show up and speak on the mic. And we broadcast those meetings over Zoom. And
because this was during the pandemic, right?
Yes, it was during the pandemic, and so we were dealing with late census data. We were dealing with people who didn't necessarily want to all be in a room together. We were required as staff to draw initial maps to then give them to the commissions so they could debate them and decide whether they wanted to change them or accept them. Eventually, had the commissions not decided and voted on particular maps, our third maps would have gone to the court for approval as staff. So we went to all of those public meetings, obviously, and heard all of the feedback. And when we were drawing maps, we were using that feedback as well as the criteria that's laid out in the Constitution that talks about, it's sort of ranked a little bit, keeping communities of interest together, keeping political boundaries together, things like that, to make sure that the maps would pass muster by the courts.
Now, you mentioned keeping communities of interest together. How does the commission ensure that communities of color, immigrant communities, and low-income neighborhoods aren't left out or split up? How do you do that exactly?
Well, it's difficult.
Yeah.
Because there are a lot of communities of interest that are actually at odds with each other. And so we had to decide which communities fit the most of the criteria that are laid out in the Constitution. The Voting Rights Act informs part of what we do. So in terms of communities of color, we have to do things a certain way if there are a certain number of registered voters in those communities of a particular ethnic or racial background. We went around and asked people for their feedback, and so we learned about what these communities were, and we used a lot of, when we were drawing the maps, we used a lot of data based on school districts and neighborhoods. We tried to take all that into account, and obviously we weren't perfect because there's just no way to not split anything when you have population numbers that are very, very precise. So you have to have a certain number of voters in each district, and really with congressional redistricting, it's plus or minus 1%. It's or one voter. So it's really, really precise.
And this transparency aspect. I mean, just hearing that you drove in a car to these communities, you looked at these neighborhoods. What has that looked like in practice? Because this, again, was the first time as we gear up for maybe the next time.
Well, what I would like to see happen is for the commissioners or commissions to hire public relations earlier than we did. So that's something that I would do differently next time to get better word out there so we have more people come in, because I think what we had was a lot of people who were already involved in their communities, and I would love to have more people come out, people who didn't know what redistricting was to begin with, but now understand that it might impact their lives. And the same thing for choosing the commissioners. We didn't have anything in place to reach out to people who maybe aren't independently wealthy.
Sure.
So I think we had a lot of sameness on the commissions for that reason. So if I were to make any sort of change, I would try to figure out a way to, give people time off, paid time off to do this. And we paid a stipend, a daily stipend for any meeting that they attended, but we couldn't guarantee their job would be there after they were done. So we had some students, and then we had a lot of, retired older people, and not much in between.
So it could be almost like a civic duty, jury duty, but better.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That was sort of my
I think it's really important. I love that you gave this type of insight, because I think the average person, even myself for a long time, thinks of a district as like a map is almost drawn like a checkerboard. There are these very distinct areas that do not change, clean lines, that's your district. But there's so much more to it. Jessica Shipley, Staff Director of the Colorado Independent Redistricting Commission, thank you so much for joining us for this Real Talk.
Thank you.
And that is this week's episode of Real Talk with Denver7 and CPR News. Every week we have a real talk on issues that impact Coloradans who are often overlooked.
You can find all of our shows on denver7.com/realtalk or at cpr.org/realtalk. Have a great day.